Okay, all the buttons are now pushed. Hi, I'm Annie Gilson. Welcome. We are so excited to see you all tonight. I am delighted to welcome Matt Bell back to Oakland University today. We are here to celebrate the publication of his new novel, Appleseed, and also to celebrate the 10th anniversary of OU's creative writing program. Matt was here 15 years ago before we began offering the BA, but our current program grew out of the workshops we offered then. Students like Matt told us how much they wanted to be able to major in creative writing. And thanks to that feedback, we created the program we have today, which allows us to bring writers like him to campus. But before I introduce Matt, I would like to thank a number of people who have made this reading possible. Jeff Chapman in the Creative Writing Program, Rob Anderson in the Department of English, Kresge Library, the Honors College, and Dean Elaine Carey in the College of Arts and Sciences. I would also like to thank Leslie Gallen and the IT department for their help handling the logistics of today's events. 15 years ago, when I had Matt Bell in class, I knew he would go on to do great things. He was brilliant and hardworking, a dynamic presence who helped to create a literary community here at OU. He still does this wherever he goes, reaching out to other writers and being terrifically supportive of their work, which is something that our community really needs, given that writers tend to be people who sit alone in our rooms, dreaming imaginary worlds and characters into being. And it's great to sit in your room doing that, but sometimes it's also good to venture out to attend readings like this one, because when we do, we find that we really enjoy each other's company. Of course, these days, you don't have to be physically proximate to be part of the literary community. I want to encourage all of you, after the reading is over, to go to mattbell.com and subscribe to his free monthly newsletter. Every month, you'll get an email in which he talks about the 10 or 15 works of fiction he's been reading that month. You'll also get a craft exercise that will help you think about your own literary practice. It's just so generous and cool. Since Matt graduated from OU in 2006, he has published, by my count, 11 books. Yeah, he doesn't know, including 3 novels, In the House Upon the Dirt, Between the Lake and the Woods, which feels to me like Northern Michigan, Scrapper, which is set in Detroit, and Appleseed, which came out this past summer to rave reviews. Laird Hunt in the New York Times Book Review calls Appleseed excellent and says it is formally ambitious, but still deeply humane, with an appealing earnestness undergirded by deeply felt optimism. Hunt also notes that Appleseed is a highly welcome addition to the growing canon of first-rate contemporary climate fiction, an observation that writer Karen Russell agrees with when she calls Appleseed a work of incandescent imagination that is at once an eco-horror story about human greed and a regenerative new myth. The mythical components of Matt Bell's novel took center stage when I taught it over the last 2 weeks. This was in my graduate English class on ecofabulism, a literary term that Matt has helped to popularize. Ecofabulism is a term for literary fiction that focuses on the climate crisis, but addresses that crisis in a fantastical way. In Appleseed, Matt imagines the real-life figure of Johnny Appleseed as a faun, which is a creature out of ancient Greek mythology that is half human and half goat. The ancient Greeks worshipped a faun in the figure of the god Pan, who was the god of the wilderness and also of shepherds and flocks of sheep. Worship of Pan was probably part of human life for millennia, in part because Pan was a deity who represented the natural world, which is where our hunter-gatherer ancestors got their food. But at the same time, Pan is also the god of shepherds and flocks, and so embodies the turn humans made over the past 10,000 years of our history away from hunter-gatherer societies and toward agriculture and the domestication of animals. That means that when Matt Bell turns Johnny Appleseed into a faun, he is able to use his novel to explore human identity on a mythic level. Through its half faun, half human main character, the novel thus becomes a meditation on how humans have been taught to distance ourselves from our animal identities. So far, so good. But the Johnny Appleseed character who lives in the Ohio Territory of 18th century America is only one of the only one of the characters in the three narrative timelines in the novel. There's also a second timeline set about 50 years from now, when most of the wild animals on Earth have gone extinct. There's also a third timeline set in the far future, when the Earth has returned to an ice age and most of humanity has been wiped out. This complex timeline allows Bell to explore what we humans are becoming and what it's costing us to remain apart from the natural world. When I was teaching this book, I was startled because I found it caused me to return to my own past too. After I graduated from college in 1986, a man named John Pearson hired me to oversee his tree farm on the island of Syros in Greece. I kid you not. His dream was to restore the forests that had been cut down over the course of the Homeric Age. After the forests were cut down, all the topsoil was eroded and the climate of Greece changed radically as a result. John Pearson, like one of the characters in Appleseed, believed we could restore what our ancestors had taken away by returning the islands to a forested state. Unfortunately, all the Greeks John Pearson employed to care for the trees thought John Pearson was a crazy man. So they'd plant the trees, as he paid them to do, but they wouldn't water them unless they'd all die. So he hired me, right? What was also unfortunate, though, was that a month before I was supposed to leave for Greece, Chernobyl blew. Greece was so contaminated by the radiation cloud that circled the planet that Doctors Without Borders recommended that tourists stay away for at least a year. As a result, I went to Portugal instead of Greece, and so never participated in John Pearson's attempt to right the climate wrongs that had been done as the ancient Greeks traveled over the wine-dark seas. But I realized how old a story it is, this one where we tell ourselves that it's not too late to save the planet. Please join me in welcoming Matt Bell back to OU.
Annie, you're going to write that novel, right? The novel about the tree farm on Greece under the cloud of Chernobyl. I don't even know why we're talking about this one when that book could exist. Thank you all so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to be back at OU and to see so many familiar faces and new friends. As Annie said, I graduated 15 years ago here. I started in 2004. I kind of a rocky undergrad. This was my third university. I graduated here 8 years after I started high school. I was really lucky to find this place after not finding homes other places. So I'm really grateful for that. Actually, the first day I was on Oakland's campus, I came down for a summer writing conference, and I sat in the student center downstairs before it started, and I wrote what ended up being my first published short story ever. So my first day in Oakland, I got to write the first thing I ever got published. So it's been a lucky place for me in lots of ways. Really thankful to Andy Gilson, Jeffrey Insco, and the Dean's office for bringing me here, and everybody else who contributed to make that possible. I just wanted to say, you know, when I was here, some of these professors aren't here anymore, but in addition to Professor Gilson, Ed Heppner and Gladys Cardiff and Kitty Dubin and Kevin Grimm really made this a special place for me, among other people. And partly what I know is probably happening for all of you, because I can hear the way the professors who are here now talk about you all, is among many things, they just took me really seriously as a writer and a thinker, and treated me as if I was a writer already, even though I, had not published anything and not got to that level. And I hope that's the case for all of you, that you feel that as well. I think that's one of the real gifts of this place. I was also thinking today, my friend Aaron Birch is here, and I met Aaron in person for the first time because of a play I got to put on of mine through OU that Aaron came to. It was the first time I met him in person. So a lucky place, and my lifelong friends have came out of here, and I'm very grateful for that. I don't have a ton to add to what Annie said about Appleseed, except to just say really briefly, as Annie said, it takes place over like 1,000 years, starts in 1799, ends in the far future. I'm going to read a little bit of each of the 3 storylines so you can sort of hear from them. The first one starts off with this half human, half animal Chapman in 1799. We'll follow John, who's a scientist slash revolutionary slash rewilder, 50, 70 years from our time. We'll end with C433, who's a bioengineered clone living on a glacier in future North America. If it's what I like to do with this, because we're reading 3 parts and there's easy sort of breaks, and that's why you won't feel like I'm lecturing at you for 45 minutes or whatever it takes, especially with people on Zoom. I know it's a little harder. I will stop after each section, and maybe we can take a question or 2 and chat for a little bit, and that way it'll feel more conversational, and hopefully keep speaking toward your interests as we go. Okay, thank you so much for being here. I'll start with Chapman, 1799. This is the very beginning of the book. Chapman wakes in the cold and the dark and the wet pre-dawn slush to the sound of his brother, Nathaniel, already up and tending to the sputtering ashes of last night's fire, cursing and shivering, huddled beneath his only blanket. Despite Nathaniel's ministrations, the coals beneath the ashes stay dead, the gathered wood wet, breakfast impossible. Shelling himself out from his bedroll, Chapman rises to, offering his brother a grunted good morning before stamping his cloven hooves against the frigid ground, trying to quicken blood, sluggish with sleep. As first light breaks, he stalks silently away from their campsite, climbing the last ridgeline of this Pennsylvanian mountain pass to watch the night's rainfall trickle off into morning mist, admiring the fine accidental melody of clean water falling branch to branch. A moment later, dutiful Nathaniel follows along, dragging their bags and tools to where Chapman waits upon his outcropping of rock, one clawed hand raised to shield his golden eyes as he surveys the forest they'll cross today. Snowpack still jamming the forest shadows, sparkling ice coating its swampy glacial kettles and its irregular lakes, all this waiting beauty backlit now by the red shroud of sunrise, the new day's dawn setting aglow a vast world not yet fully explored. This, brother, Nathaniel says, placing one calloused hand on taller Chapman's bare brown shoulder, waving the other out over the territory below. This is where we'll make our fortune. Pointing out the first landmarks they're due to pass today, he traces a path out of this mountain gap and down through the slim strand of tilled earth that gives entrance to the Ohio territory, then the way beyond into the unsettled, unmapped forest swamps of the interior, past the river bottomlands and sheltered ravines where they sowed last year's nurseries, toward the next uninhabited acres where they'll aim to plant this year's seeds. As Nathaniel happily details his plans, Chapman smiles his much practiced smile, his sharp teeth slipping from behind his broad lips. Look, brother, he interrupts, pointing out dim campfires barely visible through the morning mist, flickers of flame and smoke rising in far-off sheltered dales. There are so many more of us this year. Every year, these fires move deeper into the landscape, each one a distant sign of strangers come to expand the human mark, to put the land to what Nathaniel has taught Chapman are its rightful uses. Here are settlers hunting and trapping and gathering wild foodstuffs, cutting down trees and tearing up rocks to make room for placeholder farms, making way for the towns to come, while others tap trees for sap and hang tin sugaring buckets over hot coals, sometimes passing the time with amateur fiddling, the inviting sounds of their instruments carrying across even the most desolate, starless, moonless nights. Together, the brothers measure again the increasingly believable potential of this territory, its wilderness cleared by war, then emptied by treaty. As he has at the start of every other year's journey, Nathaniel tells Chapman again how this taken land can now be brought to heel by industrious men, How by many hands the foundations of a new civilization will be laid here, the land year by year made ready for the coming of our people, until one day the uncultivated earth gives way to what he says will surely be the grandest of cities, each graced by the tallest buildings and the widest avenues, all populated by an endless parade of hardy settlers, planting horizon-busting fields of wind-tilted golden grain, harvesting fruitful orchards planted by these two forward-thinking brothers. Chapman and Nathaniel and these others gathered around their distant fires are only the first to come, he says. Even if our industries should fail entirely, Nathaniel concludes, surely we will not be the last. Nathaniel has said this for 10 years now, the same lines recited from the same mountain pass at the outset of each year's venture. It's time to go, Chapman says, suddenly impatient with his brother's story. He ties his bedroll and his tools over one bare shoulder, slings his leather seed bag around the other. The morning air is chilled and damp, but the bark of his skin keeps him warm enough that even in winter he wears no shirt or coat, only a pair of trousers hacked off above his inhuman knees. He dusts the last of the night's frost from his flanks, then whinnies lowly, stretching tall to rub the smooth shells of his curved horns with his clawed hands. First his broken horn, and then its intact twin for luck. Nathaniel laughs, then mimics his brother's superstitions, rubbing his own bare temples, where just recently a few gray hairs have started creeping through the brown. Meet you at the river, Nathaniel teases, sidestepping onto the narrow trace path leading down the ridgeline, if you can catch me. Nathaniel rushes to build his slim head start, but his advantage doesn't last long. A moment later, Chapman surges past him to drop down the steep plunge of the mountainside, his hooves sliding precariously on loose scree as he picks up speed, the joy of moving fast filling him from the inside out, his fur standing on end, his heart leaping with happy effort. He quickens his pace with every step until a barking cry rips free of him, the sound of his voice foreign enough to this territory and every other to frighten all the nearby roosting birds into sudden startled flight, the gray sky filling with their black silhouettes, their many cries during the whooping of this one fawn returned at last to wildest lands. Wherever Chapman ventures next, there waits some unnamed waterway or unexplored meadow, some ridge never described, never made anyone's landmark. Or so Chapman once believed, come late to this landscape cleared of its most recent inhabitants. Now he just as frequently exits untouched woods to find newly planted lands, the forest brambles burned back, its glacier-spilled stones stacked into makeshift garden walls, so many trees felled to make rough sawn boards, boards nailed into unsound houses held upright by mortar and tar and hope. New construction makes Chapman nervous, long in habitation doubly so. From his youngest days, he could follow a wooded trail haphazardly stamped flat, but couldn't abide a road cleared by men with picks and shovels and mules. He could skirt the edges of farms, but couldn't cross their fenced-in fields without his skin aching with hives, his bones burning in their sockets. Only after Nathaniel hit on the idea of planting frontier orchards did Chapman begin to better acculturate himself, their nurseries tucked amid their wilder cousins, easing his flesh toward the idea of the domesticated. Nathaniel stands of apple trees wild enough for Chapman to pass among them, as long as the trees are planted from seeds and never grafted. By midday, he reaches the river he seeks, the sun emerging over its clear, fast course, its waterline raised by snowmelt and spring rains. He squats over his hooves to scan the sparkling water for signs of trout coming up to feed on the gathering insects, hungry for their pleasurable slap and splash, then picks a tick from his fur, squeezing the pin of its head with clawed fingers, the pressure not enough to kill it, but certainly to make it release. Waiting for Nathaniel, Chapman swings his bag around his bare frame, rests it above his bony knees. He pulls it open even though he shouldn't. The seeds could easily dry out despite the moist pumice and pulp, and then he plunges his head into the bag's opening, breathes deep the wet ferment inside. Around him are 1,000 fresher scents, all the territories, perfumes and poisons, promises and provocations. But Chapman's favorite is the one he carries lashed to his chest, kept contained within his satchel, not the attractive smell of apples ready to be picked, not the smell becoming taste of an apple bitten, but this rotten, stinking hope, the intoxicating promise of what next. The tree, the tree, the tree. Taste and smell are almost the same sense, even in memory, even in dream. With his face buried in the leather bag, Chapman imagines the taste smell of the apple of the tree. He tells himself it's possible to plant, to grow, to harvest one glowing apple from. One apple, all he'll need to change his life. Let Nathaniel make his fortune if he can. All Chapman wants is one particular apple. I'll stop there from that timeline. Just find my bookmark for the next part. Oh, thank you. As I said, I'm happy to maybe stop between sections and chat with you all for a bit. People who are on the Zoom, if you have questions and want to put them there, I can see them and we'll try to look out of the corner of my eye. But happy to answer questions. I know some of you have read the book, either about the book or about writing in general. Yeah, Jeffrey.
So Matt, I have a question. So when we were talking about your book last night, I learned to my surprise, students don't know that Johnny Appleseed,
Oh, interesting.
which was surprising to me, also really interesting. Because I was thinking it's timely to be rethinking the Johnny Appleseed story.
Sure.
The planetary emergency. But it turns out it's also a moment where the Johnny Appleseed myth is sort of dying off of its own accord. Like in some weird way, you're reviving the Johnny Appleseed. And I was just wondering if you could just talk, not so much about that, but like what drew you to the Johnny Appleseed story as a central device in the first place at this moment.
How many people before we start talking about this know like who Johnny Appleseed is when we're talking about that? But it's not everybody, right? But it's, yeah. I mean, I feel like I wonder too if it was like maybe Midwestern in some way too, because it is Midwestern, right? And you know, for those who don't know, Johnny Appleseed was a real person in the 1700s who was planting apple trees all over Ohio and Indiana, mostly in an attempt to make money as settlers were white European settlers were coming west into the Midwest. They were granted homesteads, but to keep your homestead, you had to use it. You had to make the land productive or else you lost it. And one of the ways you made it productive was to have 10 fruiting trees. It could be apple trees or peach trees mostly was what people were trying to grow. And so the real Johnny Appleseed's plan was to plant these apple trees and then sell them to people when they showed up. He was mostly planting on land he didn't own, figuring he could get the trees off it before someone showed up. And he ended up actually, in my book, he's not very successful. In real life, he did fine and retired a reasonably wealthy guy in Fort Wayne, which is not how this ends. But it is interesting to think about that. You know, I think probably encountered, and there's a Disney movie from, I think, the 50s that, yeah, many of us know, and that sort of earwormy song in that, like, the Lord's been good to me, and so I think the Lord, that he sort of sings as he's, you know, picking apples. But that's from a series of Disney cartoons that are all these, like, American myth making, you know, which is very much even what they're for, I think, is to reinforce them. That it's them and Paul Bunyan and Pecos Pete and some of these like mythological figures. So it is interesting. It does seem, I mean, one of the things I love about fairy tale and myth in general is that I think they're the ones that have lasted are inexhaustible. Like, you can't do damage to the Greek myths by retelling them. Like, you can't do damage to Little Red Riding Hood by making your own version of it. And I think that's probably true of these two. You can retell them, you can recast them, you can make them read a different way, but like 1,000 Johnny Appleseed retellings can probably exist. 1,000 John Henry retellings can probably exist. So it's sort of interesting as source material because they're so rich, they're so sparse and yet rich. And they really do feel to me like inexhaustible sources. Maybe one of the rare renewable resources of the world, right? Myth and fairy tale. Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I saw you had a question too.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, I mean, you have like pre-existing narratives and like pre-existing like time areas. Like, that sounds like that's very ambitious, but also sounds very scary.
Yeah.
To me. So like, I'm just wondering, like, why you do that, and like, how was it to try to keep all these three narratives in line?
Yeah, absolutely. It is difficult, I think, right? I would say mostly in like the first draft of the book, I did not. They were like kind of out of control and I didn't know how they went together. I didn't really understand the connections between them. I just eventually kind of discovered that these were the three, I think of them as like planks of time that I was interested in this 1,000-year story. But I didn't really know how they worked. In the second draft, I made an outline for each of them and I kind of wrote them in the like a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 kind of way. And then I edited them as individual storylines. So I edited all of the first storyline like it was its own book, and then edited all the second one like its own book, kind of making them stand alone. And then I did this like interweaving thing kind of at the end. So I worked on this book for like 3.5 years before I sent it to my agent. And in the last 6 months is when I put it in the order. It's in the book now. So really, really late in the process. There was definitely a part where I just had to believe that these things were all part of the same book, which was sort of a weird time. I think there's a part of novel writing that seems to be just being willing to live with uncertainty. Like you're doing something that's interesting to you and you're having fun, and like you'll be able to make it work if you just stay at it. But yeah, I don't know. I couldn't have done it in advance, I guess, right? Like there was no version of this book where I wrote an outline and then wrote it. I kind of discovered it as I went. And even some of, I think, the things that are suspenseful in the book happened because one of the storylines is shorter than the other, and I had to hide that so the reader didn't notice that I just ran out of material. I ended up trying to find a way to like make that into a suspenseful thing, but it was really like this, like, how am I going to solve this problem I've made for myself? So I don't know if any of that's helpful, except to say like, you'll figure it out if you want to try it, but it is like, yeah. And of course I have like lots of charts and stuff, right? But yeah, it is tricky in that way. Yeah, Jeff, and then I'll go back to reading for a bit.
At what point did become a fraud? When did, it's kind of a shocking element of the sort of give this legendary figure, and he's a fraud. It's not just kind of a fraud, he's a fraud.
Yeah, it's funny because my editor said it to me the first time. She's like, I thought it was like a gesture, and then it was like, oh, he's doing this. Right.
And then it brings in the witches and stuff like that. When did that happen? And was it like for you, was that what was that moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the book started. The very first idea was Johnny Appleseed, but he's a fawn. Like that's the initial like internal pitch for the book. This is why I don't tell my agent ideas until I've been working on them for 3 years. I called him like, I'm gonna write a 500-page book about Johnny Appleseed, but he's a fawn. He's like, don't. But yeah, that was the starting place. And Annie brought up Michael Pollan's Botany of Desire, but I was listening to that book when I was out for a run, and he starts talking about Johnny Appleseed, this Dionysian figure who spread, like alcohol essentially over America, which is correct. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be funny to write Johnny Appleseed as like a literal Dionysian figure? And that was really sort of the origin of the book. Was that I was reading a lot of books about agriculture and food systems, which obviously is in the book as well. So I was sort of doing this research for my own use on industrial agriculture, and just happened to come across this Johnny Appleseed anecdote. And then I'd always loved that fairy tales or folktale as a kid. And it just fired that off. So like the very first day of writing is just like a paragraph that's like that clawed furred hand planting a seed. And that's all I wrote that day. And everything else I just discovered from going forward from that. Which again, that like, how do you make up all this stuff? It's like, it's kind of wild that all came from a guy with hooves planting an apple tree, But yeah, that's where it came from. Yeah, please. No, please.
I'm interested in the fact that you wrote this novel about this hybrid.
Yeah.
And I could think of a couple novels that came out in about 6 months.
Yeah.
That are also about human animal hybrids.
Yeah.
Different sorts. I wonder if you could just think about, do you have any sense of why you're in the same kind of intellectual, creative?
Sure.
Mindset? It seems to be going around.
Yeah, I think maybe part of it is like a necessary sort of decentering of the human in our story that feels like a lot of us are thinking about, that putting human beings at the center of every story is not necessarily good for us. I think Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement is part of that. For those people who don't know that, it's sort of a critique of especially realist fiction's inability maybe to deal with climate change. That's part of it. So it's not just climate change books. I'm thinking like Rachel Yoder's novel is not a climate change novel, but is that, yeah. Yeah, and so I think some of it is, I think one thing some of us feel as a loss is that sort of loss of animality. I think some of it is a want for wildness in our own lives. I'm thinking about Yoder's book. It's Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch. It's a book about it's great. It's a book about a young mother who turns into a dog at night and like roams wild through the suburbs. And I think if you live in the suburbs, like a want for wildness seems like a obvious sort of want in some ways. So I think I think we're compelled in that way in some ways. I think people are sort of embracing that and exploring that right now. We've always had stories of people turning into animals. That's Ovid, right? I mean, like that's again, like as old as we can go back. We sort of have that. So I don't know. I'm for it though. More transformational stories right now. I think 2 of my 3 novels have humans turning into animals in them, you know, and actually in the next book definitely does as well. So it may just be, I'm glad to see my genre being recognized. I'm going to read from the next point of view, which is John, who's in the late 21st century. You'll hear some of the world building here at the beginning, because this one starts off as sort of a reset of the United States sort of political situation. But it's late climate change. Things have gone very badly. I was in some ways trying to write like a plausible worst case scenario. Like sort of if we didn't do anything, this might be where we got. So that's sort of the premise of this part of the book. This part takes place in Yellowstone, in the Lamar Valley, which is one of the places where you'd see all the bison if you went to Yellowstone. So you may have been there, some of you. I'll just say, like, one of the tasks of like the early pages of a novel is to create urgency, the reason the story has to exist, the reason characters have to do what they had. And one of the ways that I found that I was creating urgency in this for me was to depict this place that I deeply, deeply love in like a damaged sort of state. And so that's where we're finding ourselves here. Thank you so much. John's pilgrimage continues. The next morning, he drives north into Wyoming through the Grand Tetons toward what was once Yellowstone. At the park's southern entrance, he retrieves his bolt cutters from the truck's bed, then clips the chain sealing the gate. His presence here is a crime unlikely to be punished. The Park Service already shuttered 10 years, but still he notes the solar panels powering roadside wireless readers there to record his ID and report his trespass, a sure danger if he hadn't already disabled the pebble buried in his right hand, that inescapable bit of Earth Trust tech embedded now in nearly every American body. Earth Trust. After the catastrophic California earthquake finally struck, it was Earth Trust that pushed an emergency funding bill through the last true Congress in Washington, a rushed order seizing all lands west of the Mississippi, then using eminent domain and the president's emergency powers to create the Western Sacrifice Zone, a long planned takeover waiting only for the right shock. Half the country abdicated and sold to Earth Trust for dollars an acre by a weakened government busy fleeing to drier land in Syracuse. We hoped these days would never come. We promised to be prepared for when they did, Yuri Mirov had said then, the Earth Trust director's broad smile flashing from the country's every telescreen. Now we are ready. Now we are coming to the rescue. 2 weeks later, unmarked convoys of soldiers and squadrons of lifter drones swarmed the West Coast, rescuing whoever they could, whether or not the victims wanted rescuing, and evacuating them to resettlement camps hastily erected in the Mojave, then to Ohio, where the first volunteer agricultural community was being built even as Oregon and Washington seceded. In those days, John had been in Ohio too, with Earth Trust, with Yuri. He'd known her since childhood. For those first months of the country's collapse, he'd felt constantly off balance, unable to understand how Yuri had moved so fast, carrying out previously unspoken plans with a brutal tactical efficiency John hadn't realized she'd possessed. When he left her company years after his first misgivings, he fled into the sacrifice zone with Cal and the others also quitting Earth Trust, all of them together promising to somehow one day push back. He hadn't wanted to meet violence with more violence like Cal had. He simply wanted to atone for his part in what had happened, for the world he'd helped bring into being. Today, he arrives at Yellowstone's Lamar Valley by noon, driving a browning landscape whose mountains no longer promise any hint of snowpack, only burned trees cascading down the slopes. John parks his tree at the top of a narrow ridge, leaving the unmaintained park road to walk into the valley on foot. 30 years ago, John's father had brought his son here to share his awe of this greatest of America's preserves, the size of its wild enough herds of buffalo and elk and bighorn sheep, the promise of spotting wolves at dawn. As a child of 10, John had stood shoulder to shoulder with other tourists to watch the last pristine bison herd, the Lamar Valley bison, the only such animals never interbred with cattle. Now the Lamar Valley's previous beauty has become a starkness unbroken by movement, its emptiness a bleak power. John takes in the eerie near silence of the valley, no sound except the wind rustling dry plants, the river trickling down below. At the river's edge, he momentarily closes his eyes to listen to the water's gentle rush, whispering over worn rocks, breathing deep the elusive scent of the dry grass and the sparse plants along the riverbank. Before he opens his eyes, he tries to picture that long ago day spent at some similar part of this river with his father, when the hundreds of bison roaming the prairie have been entirely uninterested in the encroaching crowds. He's come today hoping for any sign of the old magic he'd sensed then, so different from what he'd felt amid the fields of his father's farm. If he could only see that something of the wild majesty that was had returned to this place, to these parklands emptied of people with the rest of the sacrifice. But when he scans the opposing bank's tree line, his gaze meets not the bison he craves, but instead the narrow wedge of a wolf's curious face, impassively peering from the pines. John startles. He knows he shouldn't approach. The wolf's 100 meters away, atop a steep embankment on the opposite side of the river, but he can't help himself. How lonely he's been, how devastated he's become by his aloneness in the months since he last saw Cal or any of the others he'd come west with. Now his loneliness colors every empty landscape, anywhere once home to more bountiful life. He fords the river, splashing loudly, the wolf already backing away from the tree line. Slowed by his sloshing boots, John clambers atop the ridge, pulling himself up by the fracturing branches of the dry pines. He's soon out of breath, breathlessly hopeless. Likely the wolf was never there. Just more wishful thinking in a world quick to punish such thoughts. But then he finds it again, 20 meters away, gray-furred, steel-eyed, healthy enough, with no sign of mange or malnutrition. The wolf permits John's gazes back. Then it begins to nose through the grass of something John at first can't quite see, then can't look away from. Surrounding the wolf are the corpses of dead bison, erratic boulders of shaggy fur. John approaches slowly, wary of the wolf and its snuffling progress. He counts a dozen giant bodies, then glimpses more hidden by the rustling grass. Here, a powerful leg ending in a strangely dainty hoof. There, a horn curving through the stalks. Through the tall cover, he sees an unnervingly large yellow eye, open and staring, jaundiced and bloodshot. It's all he can see of a massive head, except for the curve of one broken horn, the rest of its bulk obscured. The eye is cloudy, staring at nothing, and then it moves, rolls crazily in the broad, black-furred face. John cries out, unnerved. The wolf continues to pace nearby, unperturbed, its tongue lolling loose between its teeth. Watching John inch toward the injured bison, the wolf's face is blank, its mask that of every wild animal, full of nuances John's never learned to read. But when it gets too close, it barks with a high-pitched yip, then barks again, the sound sharper now. At this second yip, the bison cries out too, its mournful groan shivering John's skin. He carefully pushes back the grass to reveal the unbelievable bulk of the injured animal, its hooves jerking dreamily, its body rocking in the dusty earth as it tries and fails to stand. It's a last juvenile, orphaned and alone, its stout ribs pressing through stretched skin and matted fur, its broad shoulders too atrophied to lift its heavy skull. John kneels, rests his hand on the bison's bony crown. The bison snuffles, presses back against his touch, or so John imagines. Not everything in the world exists for him, and certainly not this futureless herd. The wolf lingers nearby, packless in this valley, where the most successful reintroduction program in the country once thrived. It stalks uncannily from corpse to corpse, nosing each of the dead bison in turn, sniffing and prodding, but not eating. Something's wrong. A wolf alone wouldn't ordinarily pass up such an easy meal. John stands, determined to shoot away from the juvenile, but as he rises, he hears, distant but closing fast, the telltale sound of approaching rotors. John flees quick as he can, back the way he came, sliding down the slope, feet clumsy in wet boots. He hits the river fast, slipping into the shallow water, crashing over loose rocks. Only when his scramble reaches the other bank does he risk a look back. Above the ridge, a dozen drones fly, heavy lifter quadcopters with bright yellow claws dangling underneath, arrayed in formation around a cargo drone the ungainly size of a dump truck. John should keep running, but curiosity and duty override his caution. He reverses direction, heads back across the cold river, then crawls up the bank to pause among the pines at the rise's lip. The noise from above is incredible. The downward thrust of the drone's rotors flattening the prairie to expose more corpses alongside the barely breathing juvenile and the improbably calm wolf. The heavy lifters descend, belly-mounted winches dropping claws on high-tension cables, their serrated jaws opening to dig into dead weight. One by one, they ferry the bison into the cargo drone's open hatch, its bulk swaying and dipping with each catch until one final drone lowers itself over the last living Yellowstone bison. John forces himself to watch. The juvenile bellows a sustained cry, guttural and grieving as it struggles against the steel claw. Its legs kick with late strength as it's lifted from the brown grass, its hooves running futilely on air until the drone deposits it among the massed dead of its herd. John hears the creaking cargo doors closing, then the heavy rushing wind of the drones turning in formation. Soon the sky is empty, not even a cloud remaining to color the sunset. Once again, the voice of the world reduces to the howl of hot wind crossing the lonely expanse of the Lamar Valley, rasping the thrashed and flattened grasses where the bison lay down to die. Only the wolf remains, sitting on its haunches, staring at John, its expression blank, but its eyes alive, watching. As the wolf rises and trots away, headed in the same direction the drones flew, John begins to shiver, his skin goose-fleshing. It's 100 degrees in Yellowstone today, 100 degrees at least. But once John begins shivering, he can't stop, not for a long time, not until his anger once again overtakes his fear. And I'm going to be, I want to be cognizant of time because I don't want to keep people over late, but I'm happy to stop for a question or two before I read the final part if people would like as well. Yeah, please, yeah. Thank you. Yes, you can always stop to tell me something you like. That's definitely one of the rules, I think. Yes, thank you. Someone online asked a question, so maybe I'll answer this one, then I'll go on. This is from Paige Therian. Says, hello, in your cli-fi essay, you include sentiments of how the cli-fi genre often excludes marginalized groups or characters, which insinuates that these populations are not imagined to have a future. In turn, you posit that representation is, I'm not even sure I can say this, concomitant with hope or imagining thriving beyond the present. In what ways do you think Appleseed sustains an imagined thread of inclusivity or hope throughout the narrative? That's a great question. Thank you so much, Paige. I think I thought a lot about who was in my future, right? And I thought about the identities of the people who were shown especially in John's part, which is the most human populated part of the book. The resistance group that he is part of. I thought a lot about who was in that, because those are the characters you would see agented in the book the most. They would have the most choices they made. One of the choices I would not make if I was designing a book from scratch would be to have 3 point of view characters who were all men, right? It's something that the Johnny Appleseed through time thing kind of forced on me in a certain way. And so one of the things I thought about was to be sure that other people were shown taking action in the book and other people were given chances to be sort of heroes of the story and to drive the story in other ways. The main other character in one of the main characters in the second part of the book, Yuri Mirov, is probably the most powerful person in the world in the book. And her character was somebody I was really attracted to and thought about a lot and interested in. But a lot of the characters in the book trying to show that. I think also one of the things I thought a lot about, and maybe you could hear a little bit about it in the Chapman part, is the reason Johnny Appleseed's story can exist is because of the genocide and forced removal of indigenous peoples in the Midwest. And the people who are characters like Nathaniel and Chapman would not have thought about that in the way we think about it now. But the book can think about it, even though they can't. And so one of the reasons to have the timeline the book has is so that the kind of manifest destiny, settler colonialist ideas of the 1799 part do not go unquestioned by the rest of the book. And so there's a way that the book can be smarter than any individual character. And I think, and probably, hopefully smarter than me on any given day, who's a deeply limited person, right? But, you sort of build the book over time. So I hope that's the case. I really do think it matters who appears in the future of stories and who's there, not just surviving, but thriving. And I'm really glad that Paige asked that question. So thank you. This is a weird segue, but I'm gonna read from the super far future part of the book, where at the beginning of the novel, there's one person, which is not what we just described. The future part of the book begins with this bioengineered, hooved, horned clone named C432 who's living on this glacier, and every time his life is sort of spent trying to get biomass from inside the glacier that he can recycle to allow him to reprint his body when he dies. So he's sort of just keeping himself alive through this cycle of gathering and sort of reprinting. And she gets injured in the beginning of the book and has to reprint himself. So I'm just going to read, this is like 3 pages, so it's the shortest of the readings. It's really just so you can see like the sci-fi part of the books. This is where he's reprinted for the first time in the book. He's reprinted by a machine called the Loom, which I think is all you need to know about this. And he can remember kind of his past lives, and they're all in this thing called the rung, which is like a computer chip in his neck. So you'll hear reference to that. But yeah, this is just my bio 3D printer sort of passage. This is some of the sci-fi that we'll end on. Being born is no easy task, no matter the method, and the loom is an especially cruel mother, fleshless and cold, brutally efficient. The first days of C433's life are hounded by lingering hurts, and not only in the thick black scab crusted where the rung support was screwed into his spine, but in the unscratchable, itching rawness where the exiting breathing tube tore up. I'm reading the wrong part. That's terrible. That's terrible. Like, that doesn't seem like, that guy seems born. Terrible. All right, we're gonna try again. Pretend that didn't happen. An assumption built into the loom. Any creature remade of many different materials remains itself. At the device's heart waits a domed stage, a hump of closed steel ringed by a series of extruder arms, each extruder outfitted with a rotating plate of printer heads capable of spinning out organic bioinks, inorganic plastinates, coils of various metals. Soon after the recycler finishes processing C432, the dome opens, its interlocking lids sliding apart to expose a shallow pool of blue-white liquid heated to body temperature, temperature of the body about to be made. With the recombinant C confined to the unsocketed rung, flickering senselessly in virtual space as it waits for its next body, there's no one to watch the loom work except the disembodied voice C calls O, the crawler's only other occupant. Housed in the crawler's databanks, O sings a harsh, wordless sound, atonal, a rushing thud, a buzzing, repetitive, keening droning from speakers arranged throughout the chamber, clicking on in sequence as the loom finishes booting. Now the loom's limbs move in concert with O's freed sound, the extruders slipping along their circular track in time with the sound, their hydraulics whirring as they lay down different colors and textures of bioinks along melted steel and fast-drying polymers, assembling C's next body layer by layer inside the viscous pool of milk-thick fluid, stacking organs and bones, lacing muscles to tendons, encasing the spinal cord in the bony sheath of the vertebrae, the brain within the shell of the skull. It prints the heart and lungs, then all the other organs arranged inside the rib cage and the abdomen, each an algorithmically determined composite of bioink and plastinet. Immense numbers of nerve cells and blood vessels must be threaded throughout the accumulating body, a task of exquisite intricacy with only the tiniest tolerance for error. 100 billion neurons in the brain, 10 times more glial cells, 100,000 kilometers of arteries and veins. Each time C is reprinted, his skull shows the evidence of a long ago natural birth in its sealed fontanelle. Always the creature bears healed breaks in both its femurs, an unremembered injury not one printed C has ever noticed. Then come the horns, rising in heavy layers from the forehead, then hooves capping the cloven toes, the left hoof keratin, the right polymer and metal. Before the skin can be laid down, the loom ceiling opens, loosing 2 prehensile metal tentacles. One squirms between the jaws of the muscle-fleshed face, sliding between half-plastic teeth and over the muscular tongue to push into the trachea, starting the flow of oxygen into the lungs. The other stabs through the abdomen besides the navel, seeking out a temporary nest in the stomach to start a slow, sludgy nutrient drip, the creature's first sustenance. The skin and fur go on entire. Momentarily, there's no mouth, no eyes, no nostrils or urethra or anus. The creature blind and deaf behind the sheath of its face until the loom sends a scalpel arm to carve the eyelids, the ears, the nose, and the lips. Then the blue fur is tattooed into the rubbery skin, one strand held in each pinprick, laid down 1,000 pinpricks a second. Oh, sound changes. The new sound is discordant and screeching as before, becoming a beseeching, an asking, a bringing forth, a summoning song. Powerful electrical charges jolt through the water in steady waves, continuing until the creature's muscle cells twitch, till the heart begins to thump, thump, thump. The body complete, a third articulating tentacle snakes from the ceiling, heading for a port installed at the base of the creature's neck. While it drops, the creature is only itself, instinctively fighting the machine, making it desperate to leap from the bloody bluish milk, wanting to tear the tubes from its stomach and throat, to lift the metal paddles, holding it down. In this moment, the creature has the same birthright of any animal, the right to be only itself, to make its way in the world for its own reasons, self-sufficient, self-aware, self-willed. Then the memory module locks into its port, the tentacle cranking its pin into place. The module has had many names. Mostly every C has thought of it as the rung, the handhold by which he pulls himself up into himself. After it's installed, the creature becomes C433, and also every other C besides, all again living inside this one body. Thank you very much. A minute or two for questions if people have them at the end here, and then I'll release you into the night. Yeah, please.
And he also has this quest for an apple that he relates to the Bible.
Yeah.
3 different kinds of myths or fairy tales, if you will, that you seem to interchange throughout the story, and like had a goal in mind from the beginning, or how that turned out to be.
I think, thank you very much. I think mostly I discovered it kind of as I went. There's sort of retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice that goes to the book, right? And I kind of got to that because I was thinking about, like, where did this fawn Johnny Appleseed come from? Where did this fawn in North America come from? And I started thinking about fawns I liked and other things. And as you all have a favorite fawn, right? Mr. Tumnus in the Chronicles of Narnia. And then there's the fawn at the wedding of Orpheus and Eurydice who causes Eurydice's death. And there's a retelling in Neil Gaiman's Sandman of that myth that I didn't go back to when I was rewriting this, but it's really stuck with me. It's one of my favorite sort of tellings of that. And that fawn, and that is maybe like my favorite fawn. And so I started thinking about that, and then that started kind of making that connection. And of course, if you're talking apple trees, you get Garden of Eden really quick, you know. And so it started feeling there was maybe some links in those things. But for a long time, they weren't kind of systemized. I didn't know how they went together. They were just sort of coexisting in the book. And there, as you know, there becomes this like tree of forgetting that Chapman wants. He wants to forget like the knowledge that humans have, this sort of original knowledge that separates us from the natural world, or separates us, or makes us aware of our sin or something. But all that sort of just like unevenly sort of was in the book for a long time, and I didn't know how it all worked. But if you just leave the stuff in there, and because you like it, I mean, I think that's the real question. Answer to your question is like, why is all this stuff in there? Because I like it. I put the stuff in there because I'm interested in it. I care about it. It's, you know, sometimes because it's fun. I'm like, what if this is also an Orpheus and Eurydice telling? And you just go, well, I don't know, what if? But I think like one real trick to novel writing is like, just fill the book with things you love, and then you'll want to spend time with it. And I think that's part of how that stuff got there. I was thinking that while I was reading this part, partly there because I'm like, oh, like bodies being made by machines is cool, right? It's just like, I'm just going to make my Westworld machine. I'm going to make my, you know, it's just fun to do that. And then you have to eventually make it work. But there is like a huge part of my process that's just like, wouldn't it be fun if, you know, and I think that's how I got to that. So hopefully it seems smart at the end, but in the beginning, it's just me entertaining myself for sure. Yeah. There's a question online that someone had asked about just advice for people looking to become an author. And I'll just say really quickly, I think there's so much you could say, but I think Annie talked about this at the beginning. One of the things is like find a community of people that you want to be a part of, that sustain you, that you can not just take from, but give to, and sort of build the communities you want, which is such a big part of I think the writing life. I think for me, the most life-giving part of my writing life is like my near daily practice of being a writer. I like to write. I like to be at the time. There are times when writing is work, but mostly it's like feels like the time of day where I get to be with my own thoughts and my own feelings uninterrupted. And also like, it's just fun to make stuff up. It's fun to make beautiful language. It's fun to write a cool scene. It's fun to do that. So I think like sticking close to like what you love about that. But the daily or near dailiness of it for me makes it part of like my life. It makes it in the texture of my life as opposed to just something I'm doing sort of for a job. And then a book I'll recommend to everybody who's interested in like being an author someday is Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Maum, like MAUM, that came out a couple of years ago, which is the best explanation of the process of like publishing and being a published author I've ever seen anyone write. And I've bought and given away a lot of that book and highly sort of recommend that. See if I can take one more question here. While writing, how do you reconcile the stark differences between a historical reimagining to a technological dystopia, bringing of lush infinitudes of trees? These are great questions. To a cold and desolate earth, was that difficult or interesting or etc.? Yes, it was all of those. I think, you know, one of the interesting things you always have to do when you're writing fabulous work is I think you have to figure out how much magic the story can hold. Like, you know, magical things have like ripple effects. And like, you know, the world, as soon as you do like, what if the world was like this? It gets weirder the more of it you put in and gets farther from ours. There are versions of this book that had more magic in them, but it was throwing off the link between the past and the future, because I want the future had to be plausibly our future for like the things I wanted to talk about to matter. Like if the world was so different that it didn't seem like our climate future, then it would have damaged like what I wanted to do. So the Chapman being a faun is like a big thing, but he's kind of hidden in the woods, right? So it doesn't change history. And things that couldn't change history in the past too much. But there's a similar thing in the technological part, like how much do you want to change about that? Where do you want to have those things? I think a thing every person writing thrillers set in the present has to deal with is like the cell phone. But in the future, you're also like, what will we be carrying? What will we be using? How will we interface with these things? There's kind of no internet in my future, which I feel like is a cheat, and no one should call me on it. But I'm kind of getting away with this. Like, I don't know what the internet will be like, so I'll just get rid of it. You know, I think trying to figure out those balances. But I think in the book, there's kind of a magic is dominant in the first, technology is dominant in the second. And I think the third is kind of a hybrid kind of thing. It seems very technological and it becomes very magical. And I think for me, I really felt there was like magic is dominating the world and then it goes away and for technology it comes back maybe in a combination kind of thing. And that was helpful for me in sort of thinking about those kind of things. I know we've been at it for an hour, so I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you all very much. If you have individual questions or you want to chat, I'm reasonably friendly and would like to. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all.